The neural collar sparked against Kalen Voss's neck as he hauled another load of crystalline ore through the suffocating tunnels of mining station Omega-7. The pain was nothing new. He'd worn the device for 3 years, ever since the Velthari had swept through the outer colonies like a plague of metal and malice. What was new was the hatred that had crystallized in his chest, dense and unforgiving as the minerals he extracted from these cursed depths. The Velthari overseer, its chitinous form towering 8 feet above the human slaves, clicked its mandibles in what passed for amusement. "Move faster, flesh thing. The Empire's war machine requires fuel, and your pitiful species exists only to provide it." Kalen said nothing, but his hands tightened on the cart's handles. Around him, dozens of other humans shuffled through their tasks. Former teachers, engineers, soldiers, all reduced to this. The lucky ones had died in the initial invasion. The rest had been fitted with neural collars and shipped to facilities across the Velthari Empire's 1,000-world dominion. The collar wasn't just a restraint, it was a violation. It monitored thoughts, suppressed aggressive impulses, and delivered excruciating punishment for even the hint of rebellion. Most humans broke within months, becoming hollow-eyed automatons who worked until they died. But Kalen was different. He'd been an intelligence operative before the war, trained to compartmentalize his mind, to hide thoughts even from himself. 3 years of careful mental discipline had paid off. The collar no longer read his deeper intentions, only the surface, thoughts he allowed it to see. And in those hidden depths, revolution burned. As he reached the processing station, Kalen caught the eye of Mira Ashwind, a former naval engineer who'd been working the electromagnetic separators. She was thin, scarred, but her eyes still held fire. Behind her, Jorik Steelwright, once a demolitions expert, pretended to check the ore conveyor while actually studying the guard rotations. They'd been planning for months, communicating through a code of glances, gestures, and seemingly innocent work patterns. Tonight would be different. Tonight, the impossible would begin. The shift horn blared, its harsh note echoing through the caverns. Humans shuffled toward the barracks, but Kalen lingered, apparently struggling with a jammed cartwheel. The overseer clicked impatiently and moved on, its attention already shifting to other concerns. In that moment of inattention, Kalen's fingers found the small device Mira had passed him weeks ago, a neural scrambler she'd cobbled together from spare parts. It would give them perhaps 10 minutes before the collars reset, but 10 minutes of freedom might be enough to start something that would echo across the galaxy. As the last guard disappeared around the corner, Kalen activated the device. The familiar weight of the collar's presence vanished from his mind like chains falling away. For the first time in 3 years, Kalen Voss was truly free to think, to plan, to hate, and the Velthari Empire had no idea what they'd unleashed. Around the station, other hidden devices activated in sequence. Former soldiers remembered their training. Engineers recalled every schematic they'd been forced to study. Scientists felt their suppressed creativity explode back to life. The rebellion hadn't started with a battle cry or a manifesto. It had begun in silence, in the dark places where hope had been carefully nurtured against all odds. But what came next would shake the foundations of an empire that had thought humanity broken forever. Part 2. The Spark Ignites. The neural scramblers worked for exactly 11 minutes and 37 seconds before the backup systems engaged. In that brief window of mental freedom, Kalen and his conspirators moved with the precision of professionals who had never truly forgotten their skills. Mira Ashwin's fingers flew across the mining station's central computer terminal, her naval engineering background allowing her to bypass security protocols that had seemed impregnable moments before. She downloaded facility schematics, guard schedules, and most importantly, the communication frequencies used by the Velthari fleet. Jorik Steelwright had already reached the explosive storage, his demolitions expertise guiding him to create devices that would cripple but not destroy. They needed the station operational for their larger plan. The charges were small, surgical, designed to disable sensors and communication arrays at precisely the right moment. When the collars reactivated, the trio had returned to their positions, minds carefully locked down around their new secrets. To their overseers, nothing had changed. The humans remained docile, broken, useful only as beasts of burden. But everything had changed. Over the following weeks, Kalen used his intelligence training to identify others who might be turned. The key was finding those who still dreamed in their sleep. The collar couldn't monitor the subconscious. A former pilot named Enza Nightfall who muttered tactical maneuvers in her dreams. A xenobiologist called Vex Thornwick who still cataloged alien species in his sleep-talking. A communications officer named Rafe Starborn who unconsciously tapped out coded messages while he worked. The network grew slowly, carefully. Each recruit was tested, evaluated, brought in only when Kalen was certain of their commitment. They developed a sign language based on maintenance gestures, a way to communicate complex ideas while appearing to simply work. The Velthari, convinced of their slaves' docility, paid no attention to the subtle ballet of rebellion being choreographed under their very eyes. The breakthrough came when Vex Thornwick made a discovery that changed everything. While cataloging the various alien species also enslaved by the Velthari, he identified a pattern. The Empire didn't just conquer, it absorbed. Every species had been stripped of their identity, their culture, their very sense of self. But in doing so, the Velthari had created something they hadn't anticipated. A galaxy-spanning network of the oppressed who shared a common enemy. Kalen realized they weren't just fighting for human freedom. They were fighting for every species the Empire had crushed under its chitinous heel. The scope of their rebellion needed to match the scope of their enemies' crimes. Using Mira's engineering skills and the mining station's powerful transmitters, they began sending coded messages to other facilities. The signals were hidden within. Routine mining reports, their true meaning invisible to Velthari monitoring systems, but clear to anyone who knew how to look. The responses came slowly at first, a confirmation here, an acknowledgement there. But gradually a picture emerged of a network spanning dozens of worlds, hundreds of facilities, millions of enslaved beings all waiting for someone to light the fuse. That someone was Kalen Voss, though he never thought of himself in such grandiose terms. To him, he was simply a man who refused to accept that this was how the story ended. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived. They would do so again. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to fight the Empire's military directly, they would target its economic foundation. Every mining station, every processing facility, every logistics hub would go dark simultaneously. The Empire's war machine would starve, its expansion would halt, and in that moment of confusion and weakness, the real war would begin. As Kalen lay on his narrow bunk that night, feeling the collar's weight against his neck, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Velthari thought they had broken humanity's spirit. Tomorrow they would learn how wrong they were. The day of reckoning began like any other on mining station Omega 7. The shift horn blared at dawn. Humans shuffled to their assignments, and Velthari overseers clicked their mandibles in bored superiority. None of them noticed that the slaves moved with slightly more purpose, that glances were exchanged with military precision, that hands positioned tools with deliberate care. Kalen Voss checked the chronometer on his workstation. Across the galaxy, on 17 different worlds and 43 separate facilities, his fellow conspirators were doing the same. 3 years of meticulous planning had led to this moment, the largest coordinated uprising in galactic history. At exactly 1347 Standard Time, Jorick Steelright's charges detonated throughout the station. Not the massive explosions one might expect, but precise surgical strikes that severed communication links, disabled security systems, and plunged entire sections into darkness. The Velthari overseers clicked in confusion, their chitinous forms suddenly seeming less imposing in the emergency lighting. Mira Ashwind struck next, her fingers dancing across control panels as she turned the station's own systems against its masters. Atmospheric processors began venting toxic gases into overseer quarters. Gravity generators fluctuated wildly in the command sections. Mining equipment, suddenly freed from safety protocols, became weapons of liberation. But the real genius of Kalen's plan lay not in violence but in psychology. The Velthari had spent centuries conquering species through shock and overwhelming force. They had never faced an enemy that struck from within, that turned their own certainties against them. The neural collars, designed to suppress rebellion, had instead hidden it until the perfect moment. Enza Nightfall led a team of former pilots in seizing the station's hangar bay. The shuttles there weren't built for combat, but in the hands of trained pilots, anything could be a weapon. More importantly, they provided mobility, the ability to carry the rebellion to other worlds before the Empire could respond. Vex Thornwick had perhaps the most crucial task. Using his knowledge of alien biology and psychology, he worked to unite the various enslaved species. The Velthari had made a critical error in housing different species together. They assumed the language barriers and cultural differences would prevent cooperation. They hadn't counted on oppression being a universal translator. The Korthak, with their natural camouflage abilities, became scouts and saboteurs. The crystalline ethereals used their telepathic connections to coordinate attacks across vast distances. The hulking Grimvold, bred for heavy labor, became an unstoppable force once their restraints were removed. Each species brought unique abilities to the rebellion, creating a force far greater than the sum of its parts. Rafe Starborn established communication with the other facilities, coordinating the timing of each strike. The messages that flowed across subspace were no longer hidden in mining reports. They were open declarations of war, broadcast on every frequency the Empire monitored. "This is Kalen Voss, speaking for the free beings of the galaxy," his voice rang out across the stars. "For too long, the Velthari Empire has treated us as property, as resources, as less than living beings. Today, we remind them that freedom is not given. It is taken." The response was immediate and overwhelming. On the industrial world of Cathara Prime, thousands of enslaved builders turned their construction mechs against their overseers. In the I-Biz processing centers of the Valdris system, former scientists unleashed biological weapons they had been forced to develop. Throughout the Empire's holdings, the oppressed rose as one. The Velthari military response was swift but confused. Their ships and troops were designed to fight external enemies, not internal rebellions. Their commanders, accustomed to overwhelming technological superiority, found themselves facing enemies who knew their systems intimately because they had been forced to build and maintain them. As reports flooded in from across the Empire, Kalen felt a mixture of triumph and grim determination. The rebellion had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Velthari would not simply accept defeat. They would regroup, adapt, and return with everything they had. But as he looked around the liberated mining station, at humans and aliens working side by side to plan their next move, Kalen knew something fundamental had changed. The Empire had created the instruments of its own destruction by bringing together every species it had wronged. Now those species would show them what unity truly meant. The Velthari response came like a storm of metal and fury. Admiral Vex Thani, commanding the Third Conquest Fleet, received his orders directly from the Imperial Council. crush the rebellion with such overwhelming force that no enslaved species would ever dare dream of freedom again. The Admiral's flagship, the Dominion's Fist, led a battle group of 300 vessels toward the rebellious systems. His plan was simple and brutal: orbital bombardment of every facility that had joined the uprising, followed by the complete extermination of every rebellious slave. New stock could always be acquired from unconquered worlds, but Kalen Voss had spent 3 years studying his captors, learning their tactics, understanding their psychology. The Velthari were creatures of overwhelming force and rigid hierarchy. They excelled at conquering static targets, but struggled against enemies who refused to fight by their rules. The mining station had been abandoned within hours of the initial uprising. Kalen's people, along with their alien allies, had scattered across the system using a network of commandeered ships, hidden bases, and mobile platforms that the xenobiologist Vex Thornwick had identified from orbital surveys. They weren't trying to hold territory. They were trying to bleed the Empire to death. When the Velthari fleet arrived at mining station Omega-7, they found only empty corridors and booby traps. Jorik Steelwright had left them presence throughout. The facility, charges that detonated when the first boarding parties triggered them, sending shockwaves through the station's structure and claiming dozens of Velthari lives. The pattern repeated across 17 systems. Every facility the Empire tried to reclaim had been turned into a death trap. Worse, the rebels had taken the equipment, the refined materials, and the technical knowledge needed to build their own weapons and ships. They were no longer just slaves in revolt. They were becoming an army. Mira Ashwind had proven particularly resourceful, using her engineering expertise to modify civilian vessels into combat platforms. The converted mining ships weren't pretty, but they were effective. Their asteroid-cracking lasers could punch through Velthari armor, and their heavy-duty hulls could absorb tremendous punishment. Most importantly, they were expendable. Losing a converted freighter hurt far less than losing a purpose-built warship. Enza Nightfall led the first major engagement, commanding a squadron of modified shuttles in a hit-and-run attack on a Velthari supply convoy. The enemy had expected either conventional fleet tactics or desperate last stands. They hadn't prepared for fighters that struck like insects, swarming their targets before vanishing into asteroid fields and nebulae. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. The Velthari had built their empire on the certainty of their own superiority. Every successful rebel attack chipped away at that certainty, forcing them to question assumptions that had gone unchallenged for centuries. Rafe Starborn's communications network became the rebellion's greatest weapon, not just for coordination, but for propaganda. Every victory, no matter how small, was broadcast across the galaxy. Every Velthari defeat was magnified and shared with enslaved populations who had never dared hope for freedom. The Empire's response grew increasingly desperate. Admiral Vexathani began ordering the execution of non-rebellious slaves as punishment for the actions of their freed brethren. It was a tactical mistake of enormous proportions. Instead of cowing potential rebels, it drove more species into open revolt. Systems that had remained neutral suddenly found themselves harboring rebel cells. Kalen watched these developments from the Bridge of the Liberation, a captured Velthari cruiser that had become the rebellion's mobile command center. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using the Empire's own ship to coordinate its destruction. "Sir," Vex Thornwick approached with a data pad, his expression troubled. "We're getting reports from the outer systems. The Velthari are pulling back their frontier fleets." Kalen studied the tactical display, his intelligence training helping him see the pattern. "They're consolidating, abandoning the periphery to defend the core systems." "Which means," Mira asked from her position at the engineering station. "Which means we've hurt them worse than we thought," Kalen replied. "An empire doesn't abandon territory unless it's truly desperate." But even as he spoke, Kalen felt a chill of apprehension. The Velthari weren't retreating. They were preparing for something. And when creatures that had conquered half the galaxy decided to make their final stand, the result would be bloodier than anything the rebellion had yet faced. The war was far from over. In fact, Kalen suspected the worst was yet to come. The Velthari homeworld of Velthara Prime had never been touched by war. For 8 centuries, it had served as the glittering heart of an empire that stretched across 1,000 systems, its towering spires reaching toward stars that belonged to the Dominion. The concept of battle reaching the sacred soil of their birth world was so alien to the Velthari that they had no contingency plans for it. Kalen Voss intended to exploit that oversight, the intelligence gathered from captured vessels and liberated. Slaves painted a picture of a world that was simultaneously the most heavily defended in the galaxy and utterly vulnerable. The Velthari had concentrated their military might there, but they had also concentrated their civilian population, their industrial base, and most critically, their ruling council of hierarchs. It's suicide, Enza Nightfall said bluntly as she studied the tactical projections. Even with every ship we've captured or converted, we're outnumbered 50 to 1. The planetary defense grid alone could vaporize our entire fleet. She's right, Mira Ashwind added, her engineer's mind calculating probabilities. The orbital fortresses, the automated weapon platforms, the fleet anchorage, it would take a miracle to even reach the planet's surface. Kalen nodded, accepting their assessments. You're both absolutely correct. A conventional attack would be hopeless. He paused, allowing the weight of his next words to settle. Which is why we're not going to attack conventionally. Vex Thornwick leaned forward, his xenobiological expertise having proven invaluable in understanding alien psychology. The Velthari think like conquerors, not defenders. They've never had to consider how someone might turn their own strengths against them. Exactly, Kalen confirmed. Their defense grid is designed to stop fleets, not infiltrators. Their security systems are built to prevent escape, not intrusion, and their entire culture is based on the assumption that their subjects will remain subject. The plan Kalen outlined was audacious beyond belief. Instead of fighting their way to Velthara Prime, a small team would infiltrate it using captured Velthari vessels and forged credentials. Their target wouldn't be military installations or industrial centers, it would be the Council of Hierarchs themselves. Jorik Steelwright's demolitions expertise would be crucial, but not for destroying buildings. Instead, he would need to sabotage the planet's communication networks at precisely the right moment, cutting the hierarchs off from their military forces when they needed them most. Rafe Starborn would use his communication skills for psychological warfare, broadcasting the rebellion's message directly to the enslaved populations on Velthara Prime. The Velthari homeworld was served by millions of enslaved beings from dozens of species, all potential allies if they could be reached. The most dangerous part of the mission fell to Kalen himself. He would need to penetrate the council chamber and confront the hierarchs directly, not to kill them, but to do something far more devastating, to prove to the galaxy that they were not the untouchable gods they pretended to be. The infiltration began 3 days later. The captured cruiser Liberation approached Velthara Prime, flying legitimate fleet codes, carrying what appeared to be prisoners for the Imperial Gladiatorial Games. The ruse worked perfectly. The Velthari were so confident in their superiority that they barely questioned the credentials. As they descended through the planet's atmosphere, Kalen looked out at the sprawling cities below. Billions of Velthari went about their daily lives, utterly unaware that their empire was crumbling around them. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could a species capable of conquering half the galaxy be so blind to their own vulnerabilities? The answer, he realized, was that they had never learned to see their subjects as people. To the Velthari, enslaved beings were resources, tools, property. The idea that property might have its own agenda was literally inconceivable to them. That blindness would be their downfall. The team split up once they reached the surface. Each member had a specific role to play, a precise timing to maintain. Success depended on absolute coordination. If any part of the plan failed, they would all die, and the rebellion would lose its leadership. As Kalen made his way through the city's underlevels, disguised as a maintenance worker, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Everything the rebellion had accomplished, every life lost and freedom won, had led to this moment. In a few hours, he would either strike a blow that would topple an empire or die in the attempt. Either way, the galaxy would remember that humanity had refused to stay enslaved. The council chamber lay ahead, its towering spires visible through the city's perpetual twilight. In those halls, the hierarchs who had ordered the enslavement of countless worlds were about to learn what their victims truly thought of their rule. The council chamber of the Velthari Empire was a monument to arrogance. Carved from a single, massive crystal that had been hollowed out over centuries, it rose from the heart of Velthara Prime like a spear pointed at the stars. Inside, the 7 hierarchs who ruled the galaxy's largest empire sat on thrones of living metal, their chitinous forms draped in the regalia of absolute power. Kalen Voss had studied these beings for 3 years, learning their names, their histories, their individual quirks and obsessions. Hierarch Mordok, the military commander who had ordered the invasion of human space. Hierarch Velsina, the economist who had calculated the exact value of enslaved labor. Hierarch Zekthul, the philosopher who had justified genocide as evolutionary necessity. Today, they were debating the rebellion with the casual detachment of beings who had never faced real consequences for their actions. The unrest in the outer systems requires a firm response, Mordok clicked, his mandibles scraping against each other. I propose we make examples of several rebellious worlds. Complete sterilization should discourage further insubordination. The AI. Economic implications must be considered, Velsina interjected. Those worlds represent significant resource investments. Perhaps selective culling would be more cost-effective. Kalen listened to their discussion through the micro-transmitter. Mira had designed, his stomach churning at their casual discussion of genocide. These beings spoke of exterminating entire populations the way others might discuss pest control. From his position in the chamber's maintenance tunnels, he could see the 7 thrones arranged in a circle, with holographic displays showing the current state of the empire. The displays told a story the hierarchs seemed unable to grasp. Rebellion was spreading faster than their forces could contain it. Loyal systems were declaring independence, and their military was being stretched to the breaking point. Sir, Rafe's voice whispered through the comms. I'm in position at the broadcast center. Jorik has the communication grid ready to overload on your signal. Vex has identified 17 different species working in the chamber's service areas. They're all ready to move when you give the word. Kalen checked his chronometer. In the space docks high above, Enza and Mira were preparing to seize the hierarch's personal fleet. Across the planet, enslaved beings waited for the signal that would tell them their gods were mortal after all. The moment came when Hierarch Zekthul rose from his throne to address the council. The rebellion succeeds only because we have been too lenient, he declared. I propose we activate the Terminus Protocol. Every enslaved being in the Empire eliminated simultaneously. We can always acquire new stock from unconquered worlds. The Terminus Protocol. Kalen had heard rumors of it during his captivity. A fail-safe built into every neural collar that could deliver a lethal shock on command. 30 billion enslaved, beings murdered at the touch of a button, their crime being the desire for freedom. The decision crystallized in that moment. Kalen had originally planned to take the hierarchs prisoner, to use them as bargaining chips, but beings capable of contemplating genocide on such a scale didn't deserve mercy. All units, execute now, he whispered into his comms. Across Velthara Prime, the coordinated assault began. Jorik's charges detonated in the communication centers, severing the hierarch's connection to their military forces. Rafe's broadcasts flooded every frequency with images of the rebellion's victories, proof that the Empire could be beaten. Vex's alien contacts rose in simultaneous revolt throughout the capital city, and in the council chamber itself, Kalen Voss emerged from the shadows like vengeance incarnate. The hierarchs clicked in shock and confusion as the human they had dismissed, as property stepped into their sacred space. Several reached for weapons, but Kalen was faster. His plasma rifle, cobbled together from mining equipment by enslaved engineers, spoke with the voice of every being the Empire had wronged. Hierarch Mordak fell first, his chitinous shell cracking under the weapon's fury. Velsina tried to flee, but found her escape route blocked by a hulking Grimvold who had been cleaning the chamber floors moments before. Zekthul attempted to activate the Terminus protocol, but his controls had been severed by Jorik's precise. "Demolitions work! You cannot do this!" Zekthul screeched as Kalen approached his throne. "We are the hierarchs! We are gods!" "Gods don't bleed," Kalen replied coldly, and pulled the trigger. The chamber fell silent except for the crackling of damaged electronics and the distant sounds of revolution echoing through the city. On the holographic displays, the Empire's military structure began collapsing as word spread that the hierarchs were dead. Ships surrendered, planetary governors declared independence, and enslaved populations seized control of their worlds. Rafe's voice crackled through the comms. "Sir, we're getting reports from across the galaxy. The Empire is fragmenting. Dozens of systems are declaring independence every hour." Kalen nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders. The war wasn't over. It would take years to fully dismantle the imperial structure and establish stable governments on the liberated worlds. But the back of the Empire had been broken here, in this chamber, by a human slave who refused to accept his chains. As he walked out of the council chamber, past the bodies of beings who had considered themselves untouchable, Kalen reflected on the journey that had brought him here. 3 years ago, he had been a broken captive. Today, he was the man who had toppled the greatest empire in galactic history, but more importantly, he was free. 6 months after the fall of the Velthari Empire, Kalen Voss stood on the observation deck of Unity Station, watching as representatives from 47 formerly enslaved species signed the Galactic Accords of Liberation. The document they were creating would establish the framework for peaceful coexistence among the diverse civilizations that had been freed from imperial rule. The transformation had been breathtaking in its scope and speed. The Empire's rigid hierarchical structure, once its greatest strength, had become its fatal weakness. When the hierarchs fell, the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. Planetary governors, deprived of central authority, found themselves facing rebellions they couldn't suppress. Military commanders discovered that their orders carried no weight when their soldiers learned the truth about their god's mortality. "Quite a view," Mira Ashwind observed, joining him at the viewport. She wore the insignia of the Galactic Engineering Corps, the organization she had founded to help rebuild the infrastructure of the liberated worlds. "Hard to believe it all started in a mining tunnel." Kalen smiled, remembering those dark days when hope had seemed impossible. "Did you ever think we'd make it this far?" "Honestly, no." Mira's expression grew thoughtful. "I thought we'd die in that first assault, but at least we'd die free. Everything since then has been unexpected." Through the viewport, they could see the diplomatic vessels of dozens of species, each unique, each carrying representatives who had once been considered property by the Velthari. The Korthak delegation's ship shimmered with their natural camouflage technology. The ethereal vessel pulsed with crystalline light that matched their telepathic communications. The hulking Grimvold transport looked more like a fortress than a diplomatic craft. Enza Nightfall approached from the opposite direction, her pilot's uniform bearing the insignia of the Liberation Fleet. "The Accord signing is scheduled to begin in an hour," she reported. "Every delegation is ready, except the Terran one." That was Kalen. Technically, he represented humanity in these negotiations, though he had never asked for the role. It had simply fallen to him as the human who had started the rebellion that freed them all. The weight of representation sat uneasily on his shoulders. He was a soldier and spy, not a diplomat. "The hardest part isn't behind us," Vex Thornwick observed as he joined their group. The xenobiologist had become something of a philosopher-diplomat, using his understanding of alien psychology to help mediate disputes between species with vastly different cultures. Building something new is always harder than tearing down what came before. Jorik Steelwright emerged from a nearby corridor, his demolitions expertise having evolved into a talent for structural engineering. He was leading the effort to convert former Imperial installations into humanitarian aid centers. "The Velthari survivors are requesting representation in the Accords," he reported. The question of what to do with the remnants of the Empire had been contentious. Most Velthari had been complicit in the system of oppression, but many had also been victims of their own rigid social hierarchy. The lowest castes had lived lives barely better than the enslaved species they had helped to control. "My recommendation stands," Kalen said after a moment's consideration. "The Accords are for those who were oppressed by the Empire, not those who benefited from it. But we offer amnesty to any Velthari who can prove they actively resisted the Imperial system." "Rafe," Starborn's voice crackled through the station's communication system. "All delegates to the main assembly hall. The signing ceremony will begin in 30 minutes. As they walked through Unity Station's corridors, Kalen marveled at the diversity around him. Beings who had been scattered across 1,000 worlds as slave labor were now working together as equals. Engineers from different species collaborated on projects that would have been impossible under Imperial rule. Scientists shared knowledge freely, without fear of having their discoveries weaponized. Artists created works that celebrated liberation rather than glorifying conquest. The assembly hall was a marvel of cooperative engineering. Each species had contributed something to its construction: Korthak adaptive materials, ethereal communication, crystals, Grimvold structural supports, human computational systems. It was a physical manifestation of what could be accomplished when diverse civilizations worked together instead of being forced into servitude. As Kalen took his place at the signing table, he thought about the 3 years that had led to this moment. The collar around his neck in the mining tunnels, the careful planning and desperate hope, the battles won and friends lost, the moment when the hierarchs realized their empire was crumbling around them. The Accords themselves were more than just a peace treaty. They established principles that would guide galactic civilization for generations to come: the inherent dignity of all sentient beings, the right of species to self-determination, the obligation to assist those who could not protect themselves, and the commitment to never again allow any one civilization to dominate others through force. When Kalen signed his name to the document, he did so not just as a human, but as a representative of every being who had ever worn chains. The signature was witnessed by cameras that would broadcast the moment across the galaxy, ensuring that enslaved beings on worlds yet to be liberated would know that freedom was possible. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for those who had died fighting for liberation. Kalen thought of the faces he would never see again: rebels who had fallen in the early uprisings, prisoners who had been executed as examples, civilians caught in the crossfire of revolution. Their sacrifice had made this moment possible. As the delegates began to disperse, each returning to their homeworlds to begin the long work of reconstruction, Kalen remained at the signing table. Mira approached him, concern evident on her face. "Second, thoughts?" she asked. "No," Kalen replied, looking out at the stars visible through the hall's great windows, just thinking about what comes next. The accords are signed, but there are still enslaved populations throughout the galaxy. Pirates and warlords are already trying to fill the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse. We've won the war, but the work is far from finished? Then we'd better get started, Mira said with a smile. After all, we've got a galaxy to rebuild. Kalen nodded, feeling a familiar sense of purpose settling over him. He had begun this journey as a slave in a mining tunnel, driven by nothing more than the refusal to accept defeat. He was ending it as the architect of galactic liberation, but the core motivation remained the same, the unshakable belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The human they had enslaved had not just led a rebellion, he had started a revolution that would echo through the stars for millennia to come. And in the end, that was legacy enough for any man.